I never thought I'd see the day when everything I believed in would crumble before my eyes. It was a Tuesday morning in April when my world turned upside down. The smell of fresh coffee still lingered in the air as I stood in our kitchen. Correction, what used to be our kitchen. Jack and I had bought this house in the suburbs of Seattle just 6 months ago. It was supposed to be our forever home, a place where we'd raise our kids and grow old together. The light blue walls of the living room were still bare, waiting for the family photos we planned to hang. Now, those empty walls seemed to mock me, a stark reminder of the future that would never be. I ran my fingers along the granite countertop, remembering how excited we were when we picked it out. "This is it, Sarah," Jack had said, his eyes twinkling. "This is where we'll make pancakes on Sunday mornings." Now, the cold stone under my fingertips felt like a cruel joke. The weight of betrayal sat heavy on my chest as I recalled the events of the past 24 hours. It had started with a phone call from Jack's mother, Linda. Her voice dripped with fake sympathy as she delivered the news that would shatter my world. "Sarah, dear," she'd said, "I hate to be the one to tell you this, but Jack's sold the house to me. You need to pack your things and leave." At first, I thought it was some sick joke. But as Linda continued, explaining how Jack had signed over the deed for a measly $100, the reality of the situation began to sink in. My husband, the man I'd trusted with my heart and my future, had sold our dream out from under me. I'd tried calling Jack immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. That's when panic set in. I rushed home from work, praying that there had been some mistake. But when I arrived, I found Linda in our driveway, a smug smile on her face as she waved a set of keys at me. "It's legally ours now," she'd said, her words cutting through me like a knife. "So you're really going to have to leave." Now, as I stood in the kitchen we'd christened with a romantic dinner just weeks ago, I felt like I was drowning. How could Jack do this to me? To us? We'd talked about our future in this house countless times. We'd planned where we'd put the Christmas tree, which room would be the nursery. Hell, we'd even joked about where we'd hide presents from our future kids. I made my way to the master bedroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. Our bed was still unmade from this morning, Jack's pillow still bearing the indent of his head. I picked it up, inhaling his scent, a mixture of his cologne and something uniquely him. Tears started to fall as I clutched the pillow to my chest, the reality of my situation hitting me full force. This room, with its soft gray walls and large windows overlooking the backyard, was supposed to be our sanctuary. We'd spent hours picking out the perfect shade of paint, debating between storm cloud and silver lining. We'd settled on silver lining, Jack insisting it was a good omen for our future. The irony wasn't lost on me now. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. How long had Jack been planning this? Had our entire relationship been a lie? We'd been high school sweethearts, for crying out loud. We'd gone to prom together, survived long distance through college, and built a life together over the past decade. Had it all meant nothing to him? My eyes fell on the framed photo on my nightstand. It was from our wedding day, 5 years ago. Jack was looking at me with such love and adoration, his arms wrapped tightly around my waist as we laughed at some forgotten joke. I picked up the frame, my fingers tracing the outline of his face. Where had that man gone? When had he turned into someone capable of such betrayal? The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped me out of my reverie. My heart raced as I heard the front door open and close. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house, getting closer to the bedroom. I stood up, my body tense, ready for a confrontation. But it wasn't Jack who appeared in the doorway. It was his brother, Mike. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft and filled with sympathy. "I just heard. I'm so sorry." I couldn't hold back anymore. The tears I'd been fighting all day broke free, and I collapsed into Mike's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. He held me tight, murmuring words of comfort as I cried. "I don't understand," I choked out between sobs. "Why would he do this?" Mike guided me to sit on the bed, his arms still around my shoulders. "I don't know, Sarah. I can't make sense of it either. Jack's not answering my calls." As my sobs subsided, anger began to take its place. I stood up abruptly, wiping my eyes. "I need answers, Mike. I can't just sit here and accept this." Mike nodded, his expression grim. I get it. But right now, we need to focus on you. Mom's. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Mom's giving you 48 hours to move out. I'm here to help you pack. The reality of my situation hit me anew. I was being kicked out of my own home, with nowhere to go. Panic started to rise in my chest, but I forced it down. I couldn't afford to fall apart now. Okay, I said, taking a deep breath. Let's do this. For the next few hours, Mike and I worked in near silence, packing up my life into cardboard boxes. Each item we packed felt like another piece of my heart breaking. The fancy china we'd received as a wedding gift, the throw pillows I'd picked out to match our couch, the collection of novels Jack had gifted me over the years, all of it a reminder of the life I was being forced to leave behind. As we worked, my mind kept drifting to Jack. Where was he? Why wasn't he here, facing me? The Jack I knew, or thought I knew, would never have done something like this. He was kind, loving, always putting others before himself. This betrayal was so out of character that I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story. But what could possibly justify selling our home to his mother for $100? The house was worth at least $500,000. It didn't make any sense. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Mike and I finished packing the essentials. The house, once filled with dreams and promises, now felt cold and alien. I stood in the living room, surrounded by boxes, feeling lost and alone. You can stay with me and Jen for as long as you need, Mike offered, breaking the silence. We've got plenty of room, and I know Jen would love the company. I nodded, grateful for his kindness. Thanks, Mike. I don't know what I'd do without you. As we loaded the last of the boxes into Mike's truck, I took one final look at the house. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the front door. How many times had I come home to that light, knowing Jack was waiting for me inside? Now, it felt like a spotlight on my failure, illuminating the end of my marriage and the death of my dreams. I climbed into the passenger seat of Mike's truck, my body feeling heavy with exhaustion and grief. As we pulled away from the curb, I couldn't help but look back one last time. The house grew smaller in the side mirror, and with it, the life I had planned. But as we turned the corner, something inside me shifted. The initial shock and despair began to give way to a determination I didn't know I possessed. This wasn't the end of my story. It was a painful chapter, yes, but not the conclusion. I may have lost my home and my husband in one fell swoop, but I hadn't lost myself. And as Mike's truck carried me towards an uncertain future, I made a silent vow. I would get answers. I would get justice. And most importantly, I would rebuild my life, stronger and wiser than before. The betrayal had shattered my world, but from the pieces, I would create something new. Something unbreakable. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up on Mike and Jen's couch, momentarily disoriented. As reality crashed back, I felt a fresh wave of pain. I checked my phone, still no word from Jack. But there was a text from Linda. We need to talk. Come to the house at 10. I arrived at what used to be my home, steeling myself for the confrontation. Linda answered the door, her face a mask of false concern. Oh, Sarah, dear. Come in. As I stepped inside, I saw Jack sitting at the kitchen table, looking pale and drawn. Our eyes met, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something. Regret? Fear? Before I could decipher it, Linda's voice cut through the tension. Now, let's discuss this situation like adults, she said, gesturing for me to sit. I remained standing. What's there to discuss? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. You've stolen my home. Linda's eyes narrowed. Stolen? Hardly. Jack sold it to me. Fair and square. Show her the paperwork, Jack. With trembling hands, Jack pushed a document across the table. I picked it up, my eyes widening as I read. It was a deed of sale, transferring ownership of our house to Linda for the sum of $100. This can't be legal, I whispered, my mind reeling. Oh, but it is, Linda said, a smug smile playing on her lips. Jack had every right to sell, and I had every right to buy. It's all above board. I turned to Jack, searching his face for an explanation. "Why?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why would you do this?" Jack opened his mouth to speak, but Linda cut him off. "It doesn't matter why. What matters is that it's done. You need to accept it and move on." Something in her tone made me pause. There was more to this story, I was sure of it. I looked at Jack again, really looked at him. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes darting between me and his mother. He looked defeated. "Jack," I said softly, ignoring Linda's presence. "Talk to me. What's really going on here?" For a moment, I thought he might break. But then Linda's hand clamped down on his shoulder, and whatever Jack was about to say died on his lips. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "It's for the best." Linda stood up, clearly ready to end this conversation. "Well, now that that's settled, we have some renovations to discuss. I think it's time for you to go, Sarah." As she ushered me towards the door, a thought struck me. "Wait," I said, turning back. "What about my things?" "I didn't have time to pack everything." Linda waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't worry about that. We'll box up anything you left behind and have it sent to you. Eventually." The door closed behind me with a final sounding click. I stood on the porch, feeling numb. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of nightmare. I walked to my car in a daze, my mind whirling. As I reached for the door handle, I heard a whispered "psst" from the side of the house. I turned to see Mike peeking around the corner, gesturing for me to join him. "What are you doing here?" I asked as I approached. "I followed you," he admitted. I was worried. "Listen, Sarah, something's not right here. Jack's been acting weird for weeks, but he won't talk to me about it. And now this? It doesn't add up." I nodded, relieved that someone else saw it too. "I know. Did you see him in there?" He looked scared. Mike's expression darkened. "Mom's always had a tight hold on him, but this is different. I think she's got something on him." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" Mike shook his head. "I don't know for sure, but about a month ago, I overheard them arguing. Mom was saying something about consequences and how Jack needed to make things right. He sounded desperate, begging her not to do something. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now. My mind raced, trying to piece together this new information. What could Linda possibly have over Jack that would make him sell our home? And for such a ridiculously low price? "We need to figure out what's going on," I said, determination replacing the shock and hurt I'd been feeling. "Jack might be a lot of things, but he's not cruel. There has to be an explanation for all this." Mike nodded, his jaw set. "I'm with you. Where do we start?" I thought for a moment. "Jack's office. If there's any evidence of what's going on, it'll be there. Can you get me in?" Mike hesitated. "Mom's planning to change the locks tomorrow, but I know where the spare key is hidden. I could get you in tonight after they've gone to bed." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. We agreed to meet back at the house at midnight. As I drove away, my mind was a whirlwind of questions and theories. What had Jack gotten himself into? And more importantly, how could I fix it? The hours crawled by as I waited at Mike and Jen's place. Jen tried to distract me with mindless TV shows and comforting words, but I was too wound up to relax. As midnight approached, I slipped out, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Mike was waiting for me when I arrived, his face a mask of tension. "They went to bed about an hour ago," he whispered as he let me in. "Jack's office is upstairs, second door on the left. I'll keep watch down here." I crept up the stairs, wincing at every creak of the floorboards. The house felt different in the dark, almost sinister. As I reached Jack's office, I took a deep breath and turned the handle. The room was exactly as I remembered it, but it felt alien now. I moved to Jack's desk, my eyes adjusting too. The dim light from the street lamp outside. Where to start? I began rifling through the drawers, careful to keep everything in its original place. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just typical office supplies and old bills. I was about to give up when I noticed a slight bulge in the bottom of the lowest drawer. Carefully, I felt along the edges until I found a small catch. It gave way under my fingers, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a thick manila envelope. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside were bank statements, but not for any account I recognized. As I scanned the documents, my blood ran cold. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars moving in and out of the account over the past year. But it was the most recent transaction that made my heart stop. A withdrawal of $450,000, dated just 3 days ago. The exact amount we still owed on our mortgage. Suddenly, the pieces started to fall into place. The secret bank account, the massive withdrawal, the sale of our house for a pittance. Jack hadn't betrayed me. He was trying to protect me. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I whirled around, my heart in my throat. Jack stood in the doorway, his face a mixture of surprise and resignation. "Sarah," he said softly, "what are you doing here?" I held up the bank statements. "I could ask you the same thing. What's going on, Jack? What have you gotten yourself into?" He closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging. When he opened them again, I saw a vulnerability there that broke my heart. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to give us a better life." I took a step towards him. "Tell me everything." And so, in the quiet of his office, with the threat of discovery hanging over us, Jack finally confessed. He'd gotten involved with some dangerous people, thinking he could make some quick money to pay off our debts and secure our future. But things had spiraled out of control. "They were threatening to hurt you," he said, his voice breaking. I had to do something. Mom, she found out. She offered to help, but her price was the house. She's always hated that we bought it instead of moving in with her. I felt a surge of anger towards Linda, quickly followed by a wave of sympathy for Jack. He'd made a terrible mistake, but he'd done it out of love. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, reaching for his hand. He squeezed my fingers. I was ashamed and scared. I thought I could fix it on my own. Before I could respond, we heard a commotion downstairs. Mike's voice raised an alarm, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Jack's eyes widened in fear. "They're here," he whispered. "Who?" I asked, but deep down, I already knew the answer. "The people I owe money to," Jack said, his voice trembling. "We have to get out of here." We rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness. 2 black SUVs were parked across the street, their headlights off. As we watched, several men in dark clothing emerged, moving towards the house with purposeful strides. "Fire escape," Jack said, already moving towards the window. "We can make it to the garage and take my car." As we climbed out onto the fire escape, I heard the front door burst open. Shouts echoed through the house, followed by the sound of furniture being overturned. We scrambled down the metal stairs as quietly as we could, our hearts pounding in our ears. As we reached the bottom, I saw Mike running towards us from the side of the house. "Go," he hissed, pointing towards the garage. "I'll hold them off." I wanted to argue, to insist he come with us, but there was no time. Jack grabbed my hand, and we sprinted for the garage. We'd just reached Jack's car when we heard shouting from behind us. One of the men had spotted us. "Get in," Jack yelled, fumbling with his keys. I dove into the passenger seat as Jack started the engine. The garage door seemed to open agonizingly slowly as headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Finally, we were out, tires screeching as Jack floored the accelerator. Shots rang out behind us and I ducked instinctively, my heart racing. As we sped away into the night, I turned to look at Jack. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched in determination. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Jack's eyes met mine for a brief moment. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we'll figure it out together." "I'm so sorry, Sarah. For everything." I reached over and took his hand. "We'll get through this," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." As the lights of our neighborhood faded behind us, I felt a strange mix of fear and hope. Our lives had been turned upside down, our future uncertain. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we had a chance. The road ahead was dark and unknown, but we were together. And right now, that was enough. The neon sign of the Sleepy Pine Motel flickered weakly as Jack pulled into the parking lot. We'd been driving for hours, the adrenaline of our escape slowly giving way to exhaustion. The motel, with its peeling paint and dim lights, wasn't much, but it was far enough from Seattle to give us a moment to breathe. Jack cut the engine, and we sat in silence for a moment, the events of the night weighing heavily on us. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and determination. "I'll go get us a room," he said softly. "We should be safe here for tonight." As he walked towards the office, I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes. My mind wandered back to our house, to the life we'd left behind. The realization that we might never go back hit me like a physical blow. Jack returned with a key, and we made our way to room 12. The room was small and musty, with faded floral wallpaper and a sagging double bed. But it was a haven, a place to regroup and plan our next move. As Jack secured the locks on the door, I sank onto the bed, the enormity of our situation finally crashing over me. Tears welled up in my eyes, and before I knew it, I was sobbing. Jack was beside me in an instant, his arms wrapping around me. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his own voice thick with emotion. "This is all my fault." I wanted to be angry with him. Part of me was. But as I felt his body shake with silent sobs, I knew that his guilt and fear matched my own. We clung to each other, our shared grief and uncertainty binding us together. As our tears subsided, we began to talk. Really talk, for what felt like the first time in months. Jack told me everything about the investment scheme he'd gotten involved in, thinking it would solve all our financial problems. How it had seemed too good to be true, and how he'd realized too late that it was. "I thought I could fix it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I kept thinking that if I could just make one more deal, find one more investor, I could make it all right. But it just kept getting worse. I listened, my heart breaking for the man I loved, for the dreams we'd shared, for the future we'd planned. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, not accusingly, but with genuine bewilderment. Jack's eyes met mine, filled with shame. "I was scared," he admitted. "Scared of disappointing you, of losing you. I thought if I could just solve it on my own, you'd never have to know how badly I'd messed up." I took his hand in mine, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that had always made me feel safe. "Jack," I said softly, "we're partners. In everything. You should have told me." He nodded, squeezing my hand. "I know that now. God, Sarah, I've been such a fool." As the night wore on, we talked about everything, our fears, our regrets, our hopes. We made plans and discarded them, trying to find a way out of the mess we were in. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the threadbare curtains, we had the beginnings of a plan. We would go to the police, Jack decided. Come clean about everything. It would mean facing consequences, serious ones, but it was the only way to truly put this behind us and start fresh. As we prepared to leave the motel, I realized with a pang that we had nothing with us. No clothes, no toiletries, none of the comforts of home. Everything we owned was back at the house, probably being torn apart by the men who were after Jack. "We need to get some supplies," I said, eyeing our rumpled clothes. "And we should probably ditch the car. They might be looking for it." Jack nodded, his face grim. "There's a mall about a mile from here. We can walk, buy what we need, and figure out our next move." The walk to the mall was tense, both of us jumping at every car that passed. But we made it without incident. As we entered the bustling shopping center, I felt a strange sense of disconnection. How could the world go on as normal when our lives had been turned upside down? We bought the essentials, a change of clothes each, some basic toiletries, a cheap prepaid phone. As we were checking out, my eyes fell on a display of photo frames. One, in particular, caught my attention, a simple silver frame with the word home engraved at the bottom. Without thinking, I added it to our purchases. Jack raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. As we left the store, I explained, for our new place. Wherever that ends up being. His eyes softened, and he pulled me close, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "We'll make it through this," he promised. Together. We found a quiet corner of the food court to regroup. As Jack called his lawyer on the prepaid phone, I people-watched, marveling at how normal everything seemed. Families shopping, teenagers laughing with friends, couples holding hands, all going about their lives, blissfully unaware of the turmoil we were facing. A young couple caught my eye. They couldn't have been more than 25, clearly shopping for their first home. The woman was excitedly pointing at a display of kitchen gadgets, while the man nodded along, a look of fond exasperation on his face. It was like looking at a mirror of our past selves, and I felt a sharp pang of loss. Jack's voice pulled me back to the present. "Okay," he said, ending the call. "My lawyers agreed to meet us. He's not happy, but he's willing to hear us out before we go to the police." I nodded, steeling myself for what was to come. As we stood to leave, I caught sight of our reflection in a store window. We looked tired, rumpled, nothing like the put-together couple we'd been just days ago. But there was something else there too, a determination, a unity that hadn't been present before. We made our way to the bus station, deciding it was safer than trying to rent a car. As we waited for our bus, I found myself thinking about the house we'd left behind. All our belongings were still there, clothes, books, photos, all the little trinkets and mementos we'd collected over the years. "Do you think we'll ever get our stuff back?" I asked Jack, my voice small. He sighed, pulling me close. "I don't know, Sarah, but they're just things. We've got what's important." I nodded, knowing he was right. But as I thought about the photo albums, the gifts from our wedding, the little knickknacks we'd picked up on our travels, I couldn't help but mourn their loss. Each item was a piece of our history, a tangible reminder of the life we'd built together. The bus ride back to Seattle was long and uncomfortable. We sat in silence for most of it, each lost in our own thoughts. I found myself replaying memories in my mind. Our first date, the day we moved into our apartment, our wedding day. Each happy memory now tinged with a bittersweet edge. As the familiar skyline of Seattle came into view, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. This was our home, the city where we'd built our life together. But now it felt alien, dangerous. We met Jack's lawyer, Mr. Thompson, at a small cafe near the courthouse. He was a stern-looking man in his 60s, with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. As Jack laid out the whole story, Mr. Thompson's frown deepened. "This is serious, Jack," he said when Jack had finished. "Very serious. You're looking at some hefty charges here. Fraud, money laundering, possibly even racketeering." I felt the blood drain from my face. The legal terms made it all seem so much more real, so much more terrifying. Jack squeezed my hand under the table, his palm clammy with sweat. "I know," Jack said, his voice steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes. "But I want to make it right. Whatever it takes." Mr. Thompson nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "That's good. It won't make this go away, but it will help. Now, about this house situation." As Mr. Thompson outlined our options, I found my mind wandering. I thought about Linda, Jack's mother, and the role she'd played in all this. Anger bubbled up inside me. How could she take advantage of her own son's desperation like that? "We'll need to deal with your mother," Mr. Thompson was saying as I tuned back in. "That sale won't hold up in court. It's a clear case of duress. But it complicates things." Jack nodded, looking pained. "I'll talk to her," he said. "Make her understand." As we left the cafe, the weight of what we were about to do settled over us. We were about to turn our lives upside down, to face consequences that would change everything. But as I looked at Jack, saw the resolve in his eyes, I knew we were doing the right thing. We made our way to the police station, each step feeling heavier than the last. Just before we entered, Jack pulled me aside, his eyes searching mine. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I need you to know something. No matter what happens in there, no matter what comes next, I love you. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I'm so sorry I put you through all this." I felt tears prick my eyes as I pulled him close. "I love you too," I whispered. "We're in this together, remember? Whatever happens, we face it as a team." With one last deep breath, we pushed open the doors of the police station. As we approached the front desk, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. This was the first step towards making things right, towards reclaiming our lives. The officer at the desk looked up as we approached. "Can I help you?" he asked. Jack squared his shoulders, his voice steady as he replied, "Yes. My name is Jack Thompson. I need to report a crime." As the officer's eyebrows rose, I squeezed Jack's hand, silently lending him my strength. This was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. But we were facing it together, and somehow I knew we'd make it through. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with legal battles, difficult conversations, and tough decisions. We'd lost our home, our savings, and the future we'd planned. But as I stood there with Jack, I realized we hadn't lost everything. We still had each other, our love, and the strength that comes from facing adversity together. As we were led into an interview room, I caught sight of our reflection in the glass. We looked tired, scared, but there was something else there too. A resilience, a determination that I hadn't seen before. We'd been knocked down, but we were getting back up. This wasn't the end of our story. It was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild our lives on a foundation of honesty and trust. And as the door closed behind us, I knew that whatever came next, we'd face it together. The fluorescent lights of the police station hummed overhead as Jack and I sat in the sterile interview room. Detective Ramirez, a stern-faced woman with sharp eyes, listened intently as Jack poured out the whole sordid tale. I watched his face, noting the mix of relief and fear as he unburdened himself. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Ramirez said when Jack finished, "you understand the gravity of what you're confessing to?" Jack nodded, his voice steady. "I do. And I'm prepared to face the consequences." As Detective Ramirez outlined the next steps, my mind wandered to Linda, Jack's mother, the woman who had taken advantage of her own son's desperation. Anger bubbled up inside me, hot and fierce. "There's one more thing," I said, cutting into the detective's explanation. Both she and Jack looked at me in surprise. Jack's mother, Linda Thompson. She blackmailed him into selling our house to her for $100. She knew about the trouble he was in and used it against him. Detective Ramirez's eyebrows shot up. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Thompson. Do you have any proof?" I hesitated, looking at Jack. He nodded, squeezing my hand. "The deed of sale," he said. "It's clearly under duress. And I recorded our conversations. I thought I might need leverage against her someday." As Jack handed over his phone, I felt a mix of pride and sadness. He'd been trying to protect us in his own misguided way. Hours later, we emerged from the police station, emotionally drained but somehow lighter. Jack was out on bail, thanks to Mr. Thompson's quick work, but we knew this was just the beginning of a long legal battle. "We need to confront Linda," I said as we walked to Mr. Thompson's car. He'd offered to drive us to a hotel for the night. "She needs to understand that she can't get away with this." Jack nodded, his jaw set. "You're right. But Sarah, she's dangerous. You saw what she was willing to do to her own son. We need to be careful." We spent the night in a modest hotel, planning our next move. In the morning, fortified by strong coffee and determination, we made our way to Linda's house, our former home. The sight of the familiar blue door sent a pang through my heart. This was supposed to be our forever home, the place where we'd raise our children. Now it felt like a monument to betrayal. Jack knocked, his knuckles white with tension. We heard movement inside, then the click of the lock. The door swung open, revealing Linda. Her eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with suspicion. "Jack? Sarah? What are you doing here?" Her gaze flicked between us, calculating. "We need to talk, Mom," Jack said, his voice firm. "May we come in?" Linda hesitated, then stepped aside. As we entered, I was struck by how little had changed. Our furniture was still there, our photos still on the walls. It was as if Linda had frozen our life in amber, preserving it for her own purposes. We sat in the living room, the tension palpable. Linda perched on the edge of her seat, her posture defensive. "Well," she said, her tone clipped. "What's this about?" Jack leaned forward, his eyes locked on his mother's. "It's over, Mom. I've gone to the police. They know everything, including what you did." The color drained from Linda's face. For a moment, she looked old and frail. Then her features hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about. I helped you, Jack. I saved you from financial ruin. I couldn't contain myself any longer. Saved him? You blackmailed him. You stole our home. Linda's eyes flashed with anger. I did what I had to do to protect my son. You wouldn't understand, Sarah. You're not a mother. Her words hit me like a physical blow. Jack's hand found mine, squeezing gently. That's enough, Mom, he said, his voice low and dangerous. What you did wasn't protection. It was manipulation. And it ends now. We laid out the situation for her, the police investigation, the impending charges, the likelihood that the house sale would be voided. With each word, Linda seemed to shrink, the reality of her actions finally sinking in. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered, her voice small. I just wanted you close, Jack. I wanted to keep you safe. By destroying his marriage? By taking advantage of his mistakes? I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. That's not love, Linda. That's control. The confrontation stretched on, hours of painful truths and tearful recriminations. By the time we left, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. Linda had agreed to cooperate with the investigation, to tell the truth about the house sale. It wasn't a victory, not really, but it was a start. As we walked away from the house, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Do you think she'll really help? I asked Jack. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I hope so. But even if she doesn't, we've done what we can. The truth is out there now. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, police interviews, and difficult conversations. We stayed with Mike and Jen, their spare room becoming our temporary haven. Slowly, painfully, we began to rebuild our life. One sunny afternoon, as I was sorting through the few possessions we'd managed to recover from the house, I came across the photo frame I'd bought at the mall, the one with home engraved on it. It was still empty. Jack found me sitting on the bed, staring at the frame. You okay? He asked, sitting beside me. I nodded, leaning into him. Just thinking. We've lost so much, Jack. Our home, our savings, our plans for the future. Sometimes it feels like we're starting from scratch. He was quiet for a moment, his arm warm around my shoulders. Then he reached for the frame, holding it up to the light. Maybe we are starting over, he said softly. But Sarah, look at everything we've gained. We're stronger now, more honest with each other. We know we can face anything together. I felt tears prick my eyes, but for the first time in weeks, they were tears of hope rather than despair. You're right, I whispered. Home isn't a place, is it? It's us. Jack smiled, that warm, familiar smile that had first made me fall in love with him. Exactly. And we'll build a new home together. Wherever we end up, whatever happens with the trial, we'll face it as a team. As the legal proceedings moved forward, we began to look for a new place to live. It was a bittersweet process, filled with both excitement and lingering sadness. Each apartment we viewed was a reminder of what we'd lost, but also a promise of what we could build together. We finally found a small, sunlit apartment across town. It was nothing like our old house, smaller, older, with creaky floors and outdated appliances. But as we stood in the empty living room, hand in hand, I could see the potential. What do you think? Jack asked, his voice hesitant. I know it's not much, but I cut him off with a kiss. It's perfect, I said. It's a fresh start. Moving day was a mix of emotions. Mike and Jen helped us, along with a few friends who had stuck by us through the scandal. As we unpacked our meager possessions, filling the small space with whatever remnants of our old life we'd managed to salvage, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. That evening, as the last of our friends left and Jack and I stood alone in our new home, I pulled out the home photo frame. I think I know what should go in this, I said. I rummaged through a box until I found what I was looking for, a photo of Jack and me, taken just a few days ago. We were standing outside the courthouse after another long day of testimony. We looked tired, a little rough around the edges, but we were smiling, our arms around each other. Jack watched as I placed the photo in the frame, his eyes soft. It's perfect, he said. As we hung the frame on the wall, I felt a surge of hope. This apartment might not be the dream home we'd once had, but it was ours. A place to heal, to grow, to rebuild our life together. The next few months were challenging. Jack's trial loomed over us, a constant source of stress and uncertainty. But we faced each day together, supporting each other through the tough times and celebrating the small victories. One particularly difficult day, after a grueling session of cross-examination, we returned to our apartment feeling drained and disheartened. As I made us some tea, trying to shake off the heaviness of the day, Jack called me into the living room. "I have something for you," he said, a nervous smile playing on his lips. He handed me a small, wrapped package. Curious, I unwrapped it to find a delicate silver locket. Inside was a tiny scrap of paper. As I unfolded it, I recognized Jack's handwriting. "Our love is our home." Tears welled up in my eyes as Jack fastened the locket around my neck. "I wanted you to have a reminder," he said softly. "No matter what happens, no matter where we are, we're home as long as we're together." I pulled him close, overwhelmed by the love I felt for this man who had made mistakes, but was working so hard to make things right. "Thank you," I whispered. "I love you." As the trial progressed, we began to see glimmers of hope. Jack's cooperation and genuine remorse seemed to be making an impression on the judge. Linda, true to her word, testified about the coerced house sale, her own actions coming under scrutiny. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the verdict came in. Jack was found guilty, but the judge, taking into account his cooperation and efforts to make amends, sentenced him to probation and community service rather than jail time. As we left the courthouse for the last time, I felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. It wasn't over. We still had a long road ahead of us, rebuilding our finances and our reputations. But we were together and we were free. That night, as we sat on the small balcony of our apartment, watching the sun set over the city, I thought about how far we'd come. We'd faced betrayal, loss, and public shame, but we'd emerged stronger, our love tested and proven. Jack took my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my palm. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. I smiled, leaning into him. "I'm thinking about home," I said. "About how we lost one, but found another. A stronger one." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We did, didn't we? It hasn't been easy, but I wouldn't change it. Every step of this journey has brought us closer." As the last rays of sunlight faded, casting a warm glow over our little balcony, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. We had confronted betrayal, faced our fears, and come out the other side. Our journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But we were facing it together, our love stronger than ever. The home photo frame caught my eye, the image of us outside the courthouse a testament to our resilience. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them as one. Because home, as we had learned, wasn't a place. It was us, together, facing whatever life threw our way with love, honesty, and unwavering support. As the dust settled from Jack's trial, we found ourselves facing a new challenge, unraveling the full extent of the scheme that had nearly destroyed our lives. It wasn't enough to have confronted the immediate consequences. We needed to understand how deep the rabbit hole went. Our first step was to meet with Detective Ramirez. She'd been instrumental in building the case against Jack, but now she was our ally in uncovering the bigger picture. We sat in her office, the walls covered in case files and crime scene photos, as she laid out what they'd discovered so far. "Your husband's case was just the tip of the iceberg," she explained, spreading out a complex chart of connections on her desk. "We've linked his activities to a larger network of fraud and money laundering. The people he got involved with? They're part of a sophisticated criminal organization." Jack's face paled as he looked at the chart. I could see the names of people he'd mentioned before, investors and business partners, now connected with lines to known criminals and shady corporations. "I had no idea," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I thought they were just aggressive investors." "I never imagined." Detective Ramirez's expression softened slightly. "That's how they operate, Mr. Thompson. They prey on people like you, ambitious, a little desperate, looking for a quick solution. You're not the first to fall for their scheme, and unfortunately, you probably won't be the last. As she continued to explain the intricacies of the operation, I felt a mix of horror and fascination. The scheme was like a twisted spider's web, with tendrils reaching into legitimate businesses, charities, even local politics. Jack's involvement, while serious, was just one small part of a much larger, more sinister whole. What happens now? I asked, trying to process the enormity of what we were facing. Now, Detective Ramirez said, her eyes glinting with determination, we go after the big fish. And we need your help to do it. Over the next few weeks, Jack and I found ourselves in a whirlwind of activity. We spent hours with the police and FBI, going over every detail of Jack's interactions with the organization. Each meeting felt like peeling back another layer of the onion, revealing more complexity and corruption beneath. One afternoon, as we pored over financial records in a cramped conference room at the FBI office, Jack suddenly sat up straight, his eyes wide. "Wait a minute," he said, pointing to a series of transactions. "I remember these. They never made sense to me at the time, but now." He trailed off, furiously scribbling notes and drawing connections. The FBI agent with us, a young woman named Agent Chin, leaned in, her interest piqued. "What are you seeing, Mr. Thompson?" Jack explained, his words tumbling out in a rush of realization. The transactions he'd identified were a key to understanding how the organization moved money around, disguising its illegal activities as legitimate business dealings. It was a breakthrough that the investigators had been searching for. As Jack worked with Agent Chin to document his discovery, I felt a surge of pride. Despite everything he'd been through, despite his mistakes, Jack was using his knowledge to make things right. He was transforming from a victim of the scheme into an active force working to bring it down. Our involvement in the investigation didn't come without risks. As we dug deeper into the organization's activities, we started to notice strange occurrences. Cars parked outside our apartment for hours, then disappearing when approached. Hang-up calls in the middle of the night. A sense of being watched when we went out. The police assured us they were taking precautions to ensure our safety, but the fear was always there, a constant low-level hum in the background of our lives. We installed new locks, set up security cameras, and learned to be constantly aware of our surroundings. Despite the tension, or perhaps because of it, Jack and I grew closer than ever. We'd always been a team, but now we were partners in a different way, allies in the fight against a system that had nearly destroyed us. Our evenings were spent discussing the case, going over notes, and supporting each other through the stress and uncertainty. One night, as we sat on our small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the city lights, Jack turned to me with a serious expression. "Sarah," he said softly, "I need you to know something. If this ever gets to be too much, if you ever want to step back from all of this, I'll understand. You didn't sign up for any of this." I took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Jack, listen to me. We're in this together, remember? I'm not going anywhere. What happened affected both of us, and we'll see it through together." The relief in his eyes was palpable, and as he pulled me close, I felt the strength of our bond. We'd been tested in ways we never imagined, but we'd emerged stronger, more united than ever. As the investigation progressed, we began to see results. Arrests were made, companies were raided, and the organization began to crumble. Each new development brought a mix of satisfaction and anxiety. Satisfaction at seeing justice served, anxiety about potential retaliation. One crisp autumn morning, we received a call from Detective Ramirez. "We've got them," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "The ringleaders. We're moving in today." We spent the day glued to the news, watching as the story unfolded. The takedown was massive, involving multiple law enforcement agencies across several states. As the details emerged, the true scope of the organization's activities became clear. They'd been involved in everything from real estate fraud to drug trafficking, their tentacles reaching into the highest levels of business and politics. That evening, as Jack and I watched the FBI lead the organization's leaders away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, that these people were finally facing justice, but also a lingering sadness for all the lives they'd affected, all the dreams they'd shattered. Jack seemed to sense my mood. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his arm warm around my shoulders. I sighed, leaning into him. "I'm thinking about all the other people like us. The ones who got caught up in this without realizing what they were getting into. How do they rebuild their lives?" Jack was quiet for a moment, then said, "Maybe that's our next step. Using what we've learned to help others avoid the same mistakes. To recognize the warning signs." His words struck a chord. We'd been so focused on bringing down the organization, we hadn't thought much about what came after. But Jack was right. Our experience, painful as it had been, could be valuable to others. Over the next few months, as the legal proceedings against the organization's leaders moved forward, Jack and I began to explore ways to share our story. We connected with advocacy groups for fraud victims, spoke at community meetings, even started working on a book about our experience. It wasn't easy, reliving the most painful parts of our journey. But every time we spoke to someone who'd been through something similar, every time we saw the light of recognition and relief in their eyes, we knew we were on the right path. Our efforts didn't go unnoticed. One day, we received a call from a producer at a national news program. They wanted to feature our story as part of a larger exposé on financial fraud. The day of the interview was nerve-wracking. As we sat under the bright studio lights, I felt the weight of responsibility. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about all the people who might be saved from a similar fate. The interviewer was kind but probing, asking tough questions about how we'd gotten involved, what we'd lost, and how we'd fought back. Jack and I answered as honestly as we could, holding hands tightly under the table. When the interviewer asked about our decision to go public with our story, Jack leaned forward, his voice passionate. "We realized that silence only protects the perpetrators," he said. "By speaking out, by sharing what we've learned, we hope to make it harder for these kinds of schemes to succeed." I nodded, adding, "It's about turning our pain into purpose. If we can help even one person avoid what we went through, it will have been worth it." As we left the studio, exhausted but relieved, I felt a sense of closure. We'd come full circle, from victims to survivors to advocates. The scheme that had nearly destroyed us had been unraveled, not just legally, but emotionally and psychologically as well. That night, as we curled up on our couch, the TV replaying clips from our interview, Jack turned to me with a smile. "We did it," he said softly. "We really did it." I knew he wasn't just talking about the interview, or even about bringing down the organization. He was talking about us, about how we'd faced this challenge together, how we'd refused to let it break us. As I looked at him, I saw not the man who had made a terrible mistake, but the man who had fought alongside me to make things right. The man who had turned his guilt into determination, his regret into action. "Yes," I said, pulling him close. "We did." The scheme had unraveled, but in its place, we'd woven something new, a stronger relationship, a sense of purpose, a commitment to helping others. As we drifted off to sleep, I felt a deep sense of peace. Whatever challenges the future might hold, I knew we'd face them together, stronger and wiser for all we'd been through. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver the final verdict. Jack and I sat side by side, our hands clasped tightly together. The past year had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, testimonies, and anxious waiting. Now, finally, we were about to learn the full price of the deception that had nearly torn our lives apart. As the judge began to speak, I felt Jack's grip tighten. The words washed over me in a blur of legal jargon, but the essence was clear: guilty on multiple counts of fraud and money laundering. My heart sank, even though we'd been expecting this outcome. Then came the sentence. 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Restitution to be paid to the victims. It was less than the prosecution had asked for, a nod to Jack's cooperation and remorse, but it was still a heavy blow. As the courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity, Jack turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he whispered. "I'll make this right, I promise." I pulled him close, ignoring the flashing cameras of the press. "We'll get through this," I said fiercely. "It's not the end, it's just a new chapter." The next few weeks were a blur of preparations. Jack had to report to prison in 30 days, and there was so much to do. We had to arrange for the management of our finances, set up a system for visits and communication, and most importantly, prepare ourselves emotionally for the separation ahead. The night before Jack was due to report to prison, we sat on our small balcony, looking out over the city. The same view that had once represented our shattered dreams now seemed to hold a glimmer of hope for the future. "I've been thinking," Jack said, his voice soft in the evening air, "about what I want to do when I get out." I turned to him, curious. "What do you have in mind?" He smiled, a hint of his old enthusiasm shining through. "I want to help people avoid the mistakes I made. Maybe start a nonprofit focusing on financial literacy and fraud prevention. Use my experience to make a difference." I felt a surge of pride and love. Even facing years in prison, Jack was thinking about how to turn his experience into something positive. "That's a wonderful idea," I said, squeezing his hand. "And I'll be right there with you, every step of the way." The next morning, we drove to the prison in silence, the weight of the moment heavy between us. As we approached the gates, Jack turned to me, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "Sarah," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "I need you to know something. These years apart, they're going to be hard. If you need to move on, to find happiness elsewhere, I'll understand." I felt a flash of anger, quickly replaced by determination. "Jack Thompson," I said firmly, "don't you dare try to push me away. We're in this together, remember? I'll be here, waiting for you, working towards our future. Don't you ever doubt that." Relief flooded his face, and he pulled me into a fierce embrace. Our last kiss was bittersweet, filled with love and the promise of a future together, no matter how distant it might seem. As I watched Jack walk through the prison gates, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness, certainly, at the years we would lose, but also a sense of hope, of new beginnings. We had weathered the storm of deception and its consequences. Now it was time to build something new from the wreckage of our old life. The first few months of Jack's incarceration were the hardest. Our communication was limited to short phone calls and monitored emails. Each visit was precious, but painfully brief. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to keep my mind occupied and to secure our financial future. But as time passed, we found a rhythm. Jack immersed himself in educational programs offered by the prison, studying business ethics and psychology. I began to research nonprofit management and financial education initiatives, laying the groundwork for our future plans. Our conversations, though limited, took on a new depth. We discussed books we'd read, sharing insights and dreams for the future. Jack's letters were filled with plans for our nonprofit, ideas for outreach programs, and always, words of love and encouragement. One day, about a year into Jack's sentence, I received a call from an unexpected source, Linda, Jack's mother. We hadn't spoken since the trial, where her testimony about the coerced house sale had helped reduce Jack's sentence. "Sarah," she said, her voice hesitant. I owe you an apology. What I did, trying to manipulate Jack, taking advantage of the situation, it was wrong. I see that now." I was silent for a moment, processing her words. Part of me wanted to hang up, to shut her out as she had tried to shut me out. But I thought of Jack, of the forgiveness and growth he was striving for, and I knew what I had to do. "Thank you, Linda," I said softly. "That means a lot. It's been a hard road for all of us, but maybe we can start to rebuild." It wasn't instant forgiveness, but it was a start. Over the next few months, Linda and I began to talk more regularly. She was eager to help with our plans for the nonprofit, offering her business experience and connections. Slowly, cautiously, we began to heal the rift that had torn our family apart. As the years of Jack's sentence ticked by, I found myself growing in ways I never expected. I took courses in finance and nonprofit management, networked with organizations doing similar work to what we planned, and even started speaking at small community events about financial fraud awareness. Each small step forward felt like a victory, a piece of the future we were building together, even while apart. Jack's pride in my accomplishments was evident in every letter, every phone call. "You're amazing, Sarah," he would say, his voice full of love and admiration. "We're going to change lives when I get out." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the day of Jack's release arrived. I stood outside the prison gates, my heart pounding with anticipation. When Jack walked out, looking older and wiser, but with the same loving eyes I remembered, I felt as if my heart might burst. Our embrace was long and tearful, filled with whispered promises and dreams of the future. As we drove home, Jack's hand firmly in mine, I felt a sense of completion, of coming full circle. The next few months were a period of adjustment. Jack had to adapt to life outside prison, to the changes in technology and society that had occurred during his incarceration. There were moments of frustration and doubt, but we faced them together, our bond stronger than ever. True to our plans, we threw ourselves into establishing our nonprofit. We named it Second Chance Financial Literacy, a nod to the second chance we'd been given and the one we hoped to offer others. Jack's experience and my research formed the foundation of our programs, aimed at educating people about financial risks and helping those who had fallen victim to fraud. Our first workshop was small, held in a community center with just a handful of attendees. But as Jack shared his story, I saw the impact it had. People leaned in, nodding in recognition, asking questions. By the end of the session, there was a palpable sense of hope in the room. As we packed up our materials, an elderly woman approached us, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said, grasping Jack's hand. "My son, he got involved in something similar. I've been so angry, so hurt. But hearing your story, seeing how you've turned things around, it gives me hope." That night, as Jack and I sat on our balcony, reminiscing about how far we'd come, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. The path we'd traveled had been difficult, filled with pain and loss. But it had led us here, to a place where we could use our experience to help others, to make a real difference in the world. "You know," Jack said, his arm warm around my shoulders, "when I was at my lowest point, I never could have imagined this. That something good could come out of all that pain and deception." I nodded, understanding completely. It's like that quote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Our wounds have become our strength. As the years passed, our nonprofit grew beyond our wildest dreams. We partnered with schools to introduce financial literacy programs, worked with community organizations to provide support for fraud victims, and even advised on legislation aimed at preventing financial exploitation. Jack's story, our story, became a powerful tool in our work. People who might have been resistant to traditional financial education were drawn in by the raw honesty of our experience. We didn't just teach facts and figures. We shared the emotional toll of financial mistakes and the hard-won wisdom that came from overcoming them. One day, as we were preparing for a national conference where Jack was to be a keynote speaker, I found him staring at an old photo of us, taken just days before his arrest. "What are you thinking?" I asked, wrapping my arms around him from behind. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and gratitude. "I was thinking about how close I came to losing everything. How one bad decision nearly cost me the most important thing in my life, you." I felt my throat tighten with emotion. "But you didn't lose me," I said softly. "We're here, together, stronger than ever." Jack nodded, pulling me close. "And that's the message I want to share tomorrow. That it's never too late to make things right, to turn your life around. That the price of deception is high, but it doesn't have to be the end of the story." As I listened to Jack speak the next day, his voice ringing out strong and clear in the packed auditorium, I felt a surge of pride so intense it brought tears to my eyes. This man, who had faced the consequences of his actions and emerged determined to make amends, was using his experience to light the way for others. His closing words stayed with me long after the applause had faded. "The price of deception is steep, but it's not the final word. With honesty, perseverance, and love, we can all find our way to new beginnings. It's never too late to rewrite your story." As we left the conference, hand in hand, I realized that we had indeed rewritten our story. The tale that began with betrayal and loss had transformed into one of redemption, growth, and purpose. We had paid the price of deception, but in doing so, we had found a new path, a new mission, and a love deeper and stronger than we could have ever imagined. Our journey wasn't over. In many ways, it felt like it was just beginning. But whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we would face them together, our bond forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the strength of our love and shared purpose.